Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being with us. It is my pleasure to serve as moderator for session 8 of the IISD Trade and Sustainability Hub, promoting inclusiveness in e-commerce negotiations through capacity building. This session is being co-organized by Diplo Foundation, CATS International Geneva, and the International Trade Center. My name is Marilia Maciel. I am a digital policy senior researcher at Diplo Foundation. And let me start by saying a few words about Diplo, which will also help to contextualize this session and its main goals. Diplo is an organization that is based in Geneva, in Belgrade, Malta, and Washington, D.C. We are dedicated to developing research and promoting capacity building in various areas, which are located on the one hand in the intersection between diplomacy and international relations, and on the other hand, on digital policy issues. Our research activities, they are the base of our work. So they translate into several different types of products, such as periodic briefings that we offer on digital policy issues for the community in general, targeted briefings that we offer to the diplomatic community in Geneva, and policy papers, and the administration of an observatory on digital policies, which has become a main reference in this digital policy area. Our research also feeds our courses that we provide on several issues ranging from the infrastructure of the internet to cybersecurity and e-commerce as well. And in particular, this course on e-commerce has been offered for 5 years by means of a partnership between Diplo, CATS, and ITC. Most of our alumni have been negotiators directly involved in e-commerce discussions in the WTO and other international organizations in Geneva, and also capital-based officials working in the field of trade and e-commerce. Through the last 5 years, I think that we learned some lessons, the 3 partner organizations, and we could realize that digitization of the trade agenda really poses a challenge to trade negotiators that now need to deal with very complex issues such as data flows, data protection, access to the source code of computer programs. And capacity building helps them to tackle this challenge, not only by enhancing the knowledge that they have on the intersection between trade and digital issues, but also creating the possibility for them to be encouraged to participate in negotiations, take leadership role. And we have conducted a tracer survey that shows that many of our alumni after the course managed to take leadership roles in trade discussions and negotiations. So we are convinced that capacity building, which is focused on policy making and policy skills, is important to promote inclusiveness on e-commerce negotiations. And this is the idea that we would like to discuss with you in this session. And we think that this is an important issue to bring to attention. In order to advance these discussions, we are very fortunate to have put together a very excellent group of speakers with a lot of experience, both on e-commerce and capacity building. And I'm going to introduce these speakers to you very succinctly, but I invite you to read about their profiles in the website of the event. I'll start by introducing Ms. Yasmin Ismail, who is a program officer at CATS International Geneva. She leads the organization's e-commerce governance and negotiations related projects. Yasmin is also involved in several projects and initiatives on gender, trade, and climate change governance. Mr. Quan Zhao is a trade policy advisor in the Division of Market Development at the International Trade Center. His main portfolio includes policy research and project management in areas such as trading services, e-commerce, digital economy, and investment facilitation. Mr. Africa Kiza is a researcher, activist, and development anthropologist with over 8 years experience in trade policy and development. Previously, Africa worked with Seatini, Uganda, where he worked on multilateral and bilateral trade negotiations, investment, and development. Mr. Jacob Neenan is co-founder of Kotakal Business Solutions, which is a cross-industry consultancy. He has plenty of experience working in the private sector. He was a senior project manager at eBay, for example. And last but not least, to kickstart this session, we have a special guest. We will have a video intervention from Nicolas Frank, who is an associate lecturer in the School of Politics and International Relations at the Australian National University, and a trade consultant who has worked before with ITC, WTO in several different projects. Nicholas will summarize the main findings of one of his most recent papers. It's called 6 Degrees of Separation, the Topology of E-commerce Governance. And the findings of this research will provide the backdrop of our discussions today. So over to our assisting team to play the video, and over to Nicholas.
Good evening and greetings from Canberra. I wish that I could be attending digitally, but due to the time difference and having a 1-year-old who doesn't sleep, that's a bit of an impossibility. So today I'm going to briefly discuss the architecture of the e-commerce governance regime from a structural or from a network perspective. So you should be looking at a series of dots right now. Those dots represent countries. These are the countries that are party to trade agreements that contain e-commerce provisions. And I've coded the countries based on their level of development. So high-income countries are coded black, upper middle income countries are coded blue, low income countries are coded green, and low middle income countries are coded orange. I'm just going to run through the visualization so you can see how the network has changed and evolved over time. So in the early 2000s, the network was incredibly sparse. Most countries were not party to agreements with e-commerce provisions. And as we march through the 2000s, we start to see the network form. And by the time we get into the 2010s, you can see that fragmentation within the network is declining. More countries are bound together by trade agreements that contain e-commerce provisions. And that is due in large part to the mega regional trade agreements, CPTPP and RCEP specifically. Now, if we look to trade agreements that are on the policy horizon, such as the African Continental Free Trade Agreements negotiations of e-commerce, and include them in this visualization, we can see that the network is clearly characterized by polycentrism rather than fragmentation, i.e. we have multiple hubs of governance in a network that is largely connected. Now, the ties between countries, i.e. the trade agreements, were also coded based on the scope of the e-commerce data flow provisions. So agreements with more than 1,500 words, i.e. deep agreements, were coded black, and those with 1,000 to 1,500 words were coded blue, 500 to 1,000 words green, less than 500 words, i.e. shallow agreements, were coded red. And the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, we don't actually know what's going to be in those provisions yet, so those coded light blue, so just not sufficient data. But the big takeaway here is that the deepest agreements are being signed generally in the Asia Pacific. Now, there are a number of other takeaways. First, as I mentioned, is that Asia Pacific sits at the center of the network. Several Asian economies, particularly Australia, Singapore, and Japan, occupy central positions around which other countries pivot. The European Union also serves as a central actor, but is largely disconnected from the rest of the network. And interestingly, the US and China are largely peripheral actors, again, from a structural perspective. Although it's important to note that if the US, for example, rejoined CPTPP, it would move its structural position closer to the center of the network. There's also evidence that regionalism is waning and fragmentation is declining. So there is a clear regional flavor to many PTAs with e-commerce provisions. However, the mega regional agreements really shifted the structural gravity towards economies in Asia Pacific and deepened existing ties between them, created new ties. And Several of the most important actors are tightly bound together by comprehensive e-commerce agreements, such as Australia and Singapore via the Digital Economy Agreement. However, most of the central actors are either loosely bound by agreements with shallow e-commerce provisions, such as the EU-Singapore Agreement, or are not bound together at all, such as Australia and the EU. And developing countries are largely excluded from this network. The network is dominated by high income and high middle income economies, and low income countries in particular are almost entirely excluded from this network. That is, if we don't include the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Now, the increasing level of structural integration within the e-commerce governance system may bode well for the functioning of that system overall, as rules and norms and information can flow more freely throughout it. However, the fact that they do appear to be several distinct and different hubs of governance within the system may pose a challenge to the development of mutually compatible e-commerce regulation. Now, for further information, please take a look at the paper which this presentation is based on. It's available at the Trade and Investment in Services Associates website as a working paper. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Nicholas, for taking the time to record this video and to be part of the event. It's really an interesting research, and I do voice your invitation for people to take a look at the findings and the historical analysis that you have conducted. I think that it does provide some very good food for thought and some points that our speakers can explore throughout the session. So with that, I would like to turn to our first speaker today, which is Yasmin Ismail, who has a great experience in writing on the negotiations that are taking place in the Joint Statement Initiative on e-commerce in the WTO. And she has written papers about it. One of the findings of the research that we just heard was that e-commerce governance network is highly concentrated in high-income countries, and developing countries are largely excluded from the network. At the same time, in the context of the GSI, we do have the participation both from developed and developing countries in this process. So what do you think, Yasmin? Do you think that the GSI provides perhaps an institutional space for synchronization of policies and priorities in the field of e-commerce? And are developing countries actively proposing regulatory solutions that will help them fulfill their development objectives? Over to you, Yasmin.
Thank you so much, Marilia. Thank you for the introduction. Very happy to be with you here today. We've been involved for the past 2 years now, providing support to some delegations and working on the development aspect of the e-commerce GSI as COTS International Geneva. And what amazes me when I saw this video and read the study is how very well this structure of the e-commerce network, or the dynamics of the e-commerce network, is really reflected in the e-commerce GSI. So I wanted to give you a glimpse of how this is really reflected there, and the implications of this on the participation of developing countries and LDCs in the negotiation. So I'm going to share my screen. I have some slides. Let me know if it works. Yeah. Are we there?
Yes.
Great. Then let me put into the slideshow mode. So I'd like to just show you how I wanted to think of this logically and the implications of these dynamics on the participation of developing countries and LDCs in the GSI. So first observation, and to take the lead from the video, we have the e-commerce GSI, which is sort of a mirror of the e-commerce network dynamics as explained. And then we also have e-commerce itself as a complex, dense, and evolving issue. And in the negotiation, we have this very dense, evolving thematic framework. Developing countries find themselves with very limited time now to learn and decide or choose what's best for their development. And the more we go, the more we move forward, the more the capacity constraints are visible, and concerns over policy space is also increasing. So this is a map, sort of the countries that are currently participating in the GSI. And from the map and the categorization of countries, we can see how this actually reflects the dynamics of the e-commerce networks and the mega regional trade agreements. So we have all developed countries, most of high-income countries. We have the co-conveners or the facilitators of this group are Australia, Japan, and Singapore. And we only have 4 LDCs, Benin, Laos, Myanmar, and Burkina Faso. And also we only have 6 countries from the Africa continent, Benin, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Kenya, Cameroon, and Burkina Faso. So it's very obvious how the mapping of the e-commerce network is just reflected in this setup of the GSI. We have the very limited participation, or the African countries, most of them did not join the GSI. But also we have Middle Eastern countries who are not mostly there. And given that the African continent is largely not involved, we also have a lot of the low income countries and LDCs missing from this equation. So there is a huge question about the level of inclusiveness of these negotiations, but also even for those who are in the negotiations, there are concerns over the capacity to keep up with those negotiations and their capacity constraints and resources constraints to continue this work in a better and efficient way. We have the issue of complexity. E-commerce is a complex issue, and in fact, we have more than 50 sub-themes in the negotiation, you can say. Only around 20 have been touched upon in the negotiations so far since their start in 2020. And among those 20, we have 15 that are subject to small group negotiations. So they decided to facilitate the negotiations, to have small groups discussions. This was also one of the solutions that emerged at the beginning of the year, given the consequences of COVID-19. And then among the 15 themes subject to small group negotiations, we have only 6 that reached what we call the clean text, which means it's a text that is almost agreed, but we will keep for now until we have the final product. So also, apart from the green list, which is the clean list, we have an amber list, which are basically topics that are medium to high in complexity, but on the other side, in terms of disagreement between the blocks in the network, the disagreement is more on the means rather than on the principles or the foundations. So we sort of place them in the amber category. And for the third category, and this is the most challenging category, it's the red category, where we have the group of themes where the divisions and disagreements between the blocks are very obvious in the proposals. And the more we are done with some of the easy questions, we move to the harder ones. So the more we are done with clean text from the easy ones in the orange, for example, or amber, we move to take more challenging issues, which means that in the next phase, the negotiations will only get more complex and more difficult in terms of the understanding of the topics themselves, their level of their technicality, and also in terms of finding the compromise between the different positions and blocks. We have also this gray area that affects, even if the negotiations are in progress, there is this gray area of the scope and the legal architecture of the GSI, whether how this agreement will be designed will affect also many of the countries' positioning and needs to be clarified the more we move ahead. So it will only be a difficult job, and it will only get more difficult in the next months or years. Nobody knows. Also, and this is a sort of something that I hear a lot from the delegations whenever we talk and speak, that they have no time to learn and choose the best for their development. Many of the way they see it is that e-commerce has a development potential, and it has a development potential. And these discussions can have some positive implications, like moving some of the regulations, for example, related to e-commerce on the national level. So we see when we check, for example, the mapping of e-commerce legislations related to cybersecurity or related to consumer protection, we can see some improvement in the past 2 years, whether related to the advancement of these negotiations, but also related to COVID-19, for example. But again, remains the topics and the very challenging sub-themes where this division between the blocks are very obvious and entrenching. So we have data is just an example, and the idea of free flow of data is just an example among the other topics and other issues, like the interoperability of invoices and electronic payments, other more challenging and technical topics. So this is based, this table is from the UNCTAD latest digital economy report of 2021, where they mapped the different positions related to the flow of data. And we could see different positions from the free flow, light touch approach until the very restrictive and guarded approach. So from the approach of Australia and the Philippines, Singapore and United States, where it's a free area, we have also the very restrictive side of China's view, for example. And we have the middle core, where the EU occupies a big part of it, where their approach is more prescriptive and more related to rights. So how can developing countries and small developing countries and LDCs position themselves when they have so many grouped options now this is another challenge that raises concerns over the policy space, given that they didn't have the chance yet to develop either their own policies, regulations, or positions. And this leads to, like I said, so it will get more difficult, more complex. It would require more work on the national side as well, which time is not in their favor. So we're talking about an increasing capacity constraint by time. Also, we hear a lot and we work a lot with some of those delegations, and we can see how their limited capacity is. So we have, for example, delegations that are very limited in size. They have one person who is in charge of all trade issues. So imagine not only the e-commerce GSI, we're talking about the whole of the WTO negotiations. One person is required to attend small group meetings, other multilateral negotiations in the WTO, other GSIs. It's not possible. We have also e-commerce requires a combined expertise of trade on trade issues, but also it requires some ICT background in order to understand more the policies that are in hand. So basically combining those two is very difficult, and it requires to have more people or more experts in the mission, which is sometimes or most of the time not possible, which means that they go back to capital, and capital is not always aware of what's going on in those negotiations, particularly the ICT ministries. So alignment with capital can be also challenging, and we hear a lot requests whenever we have like capacity building and trainings. We hear a lot requests from Geneva delegates to include also experts and government officials from the capital to be more informed and to gain more understanding on the topics on hand. And of course, limited resources to conduct stakeholder consultations and national polls, which is, I mean, one of the key requirements for any developed country, high-income country to adopt legislation, whether nationally or otherwise, is to consult with their stakeholders, private sectors, and the circle of interested stakeholders, which they don't have the resources for. And unfortunately, we don't see many projects that provide the resources or capacity building to conduct these studies at the level needed. And finally, it is not. Yeah, so the result is, of course, limited participation. We can see very limited participation from small developing countries in the negotiations with proposals. We can see proposals all the time from the bigger countries. But for developing countries, we see very limited proposals. However, the positive point is that given the increasing need for technical assistance, we see proposals for technical assistance and capacity building within the negotiation. A recent one was submitted by Côte d'Ivoire, but also another proposal for flexibilities. So this is a positive sign. However, it means that a lot more is needed to empower them in the negotiation. Thank you so much. These are just samples of the work of GUTS, and I'll be looking forward to hear from you, your questions and views. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yasmin. The papers that you have written throughout this process have been always very enlightening to everyone who wants to understand the dynamics and the substance of the GSI. Thank you for these highlights. I will turn now to our second speaker, Juan Zhao. I would like to propose that we do sort of a zoomed-in analysis of this gap between developed and developing countries that Yasmin has highlighted in her presentation as well. To which extent do you believe that this gap is related to the disparity of capacities and resources, and how capacity building initiatives focused on policymakers specifically and regulators could help to overcome this gap in practice? I know that ITC has a lot of experience with capacity building, so it would be excellent to hear your thoughts on that. Juan, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Marilia, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you who are joining this session. I think it's a very important topic to discuss, obviously, because e-commerce is of growing importance. A lot of activities are moving online. I was just reading a recent article comparing the sales numbers from the last Black Friday. And it seems that many of the offline shops in the US are getting as many as 30% less visitors for the last Black Friday, whereas the online shops as Amazon and other platforms are getting more visitors and sales. And same is happening also in many other places around the world, including in the developing countries. So obviously e-commerce is important. But as we have seen that in the introductory video and also in what Yasmin has presented, developing countries are to some extent absent in the real rules making process on e-commerce. There are only four participants, four LDC participants in the WTO GSI negotiation on e-commerce. Only 6 African members are in the negotiations, and this is a big contrast with the request, for example, that ITC receives to support the countries on e-commerce. Almost every country we talk with, e-commerce is high on their agenda, requiring capacity building and technical assistance. So certainly there's a very visible gap in terms of the perceived importance of this topic, and also the actual participation of developing and least developed countries in the rules-making processes on e-commerce. I think there was a question on whether how WTO can support the members on this topic. I think there are many international organizations that are active in this area, providing technical assistance and capacity building. DIPLO is one of them. ITC as a joint agency of the UN and WTO. We are also providing technical assistance to MSMEs, including on e-commerce. UNCTAD, for example, has a large program on e-trade for all. And WTO obviously focuses more on the trade negotiations and provides supports in terms of building capacity for trade negotiation. For ITC, I think the focus on e-commerce and digitalization is embedded in all of our offerings, from building conducive policy and business environment to sector-specific strategies. And also we have a lot of projects on the ground helping to build capacity of SMEs to engage in e-commerce. We have a platform called eConnect, Ecom Connect, and which provides the trainings to the SMEs. So now coming back to the capacity gaps in terms of negotiations, I think Jasmine has already touched upon many of those aspects. And I think for effective participation in the e-commerce negotiations, it is really a challenging task for the developing and the least developed countries, because essentially, if you are, personally, I've worked at the mission, so I know how it feels like when you have to go to the meetings and to to talk to those proposals and also to develop your own proposals, it's really a difficult task. And also, as Yasmin mentioned, that for most developing and least developed countries, there's only 1 or 2 person covering the whole trade portfolio, and e-commerce is only one of them. So for example, to participate in these e-commerce negotiations, the diplomat, the trade negotiator, has to have first technical knowledge. He or she has to understand, how internet works, what are data centers, how blockchains and algorithms work, what are the implications of 5G, AI, and all that. So that is quite far away from the traditional trade diplomats because they're not trained on those topics. And second, I think they also need business knowledge. For example, one of the most frequently asked questions is why venture capitals are pouring their money into the tech and e-commerce companies, even though those companies are not making money and they're just burning money at the at a lightning speed. So what's their business model? How are they going to make returns on the investments? Other things, for example, why has Facebook recently changed their name to Meta? What does it mean? So business knowledge, I think, would be quite important also in the sense to understand where the value is, how the value is generated, and how the developing countries can engage in this process. And third, I think the negotiators also need policy knowledge. They need to know what are the latest developments in the policy world. For example, what is the status of the negotiation at OECD on digital services tax, which is one of the key issues. For example, what is the de minimis? What does data localization mean? So with all of these technical knowledge, business knowledge, policy knowledge combined, I think that can help the negotiators to effectively engage and participate in the negotiations, to analyze various proposals and to formulate their own proposals based on the country's specific needs and situations. This is why I think this joint course that we have with Diplo and CUTS are very useful, because essentially it covers all 3 areas that have been mentioned: technical knowledge, business knowledge, and policy knowledge. And it also offers an opportunity to exchange, as we call it, just in time, about what are the latest developments in the policy area. So I've been speaking a lot about what are needed for the trade negotiators. But beyond these, there are also more systemic issues. Human resource constraints was mentioned by Yasmin, that the shortage of staff at the missions, the capacity of capital agencies to support the negotiations, because e-commerce essentially involves multiple agencies: telecom, finance, transportation, consumer protection, cybersecurity, data privacy. So all of these agencies need to be activated and participate in the negotiations, because essentially they are the decision makers on the subject that they cover. And therefore, there needs to be an effective coordination mechanism in the capitals to bring together all these regulators and to formulate a coordinated approach and position in the negotiations. And also, finally, the private sector need to participate. And that's one of the areas where developed countries are doing much better, because they have more professional associations and industry bodies that can channel the views of the firms, of the companies, to the policymakers. So that's why I think, for example, in our projects in Sri Lanka and in Bhutan, we're also trying to organize some public-private dialogues to bring the private sectors on board to tell them what's happening, how they can put their views to the decision makers. So I hope that kind of provided a bit of more information about what are the gaps, and also what are some of the suggestions to address those gaps. Over to you, Marilia.
Thank you very much, Kwan. Always a very thoughtful points based on your vast experience. And I think one of the points that you mentioned that really resonate is the need to make this connection between what happens and what is negotiated in Geneva back to capitals. And I think that this actually provides a good transition for us to hear from Africa Kiza, who has a great experience about the reality of e-commerce negotiations and e-commerce development in Africa. And we heard that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, Free Trade Area is scheduling the negotiation of an e-commerce specific protocol. And according to the video that we heard in the beginning, this agreement could be actually a game changer when it comes to connecting Africa to the global network of e-commerce agreements. And so Africa, perhaps you could share some insights on the status of these negotiations, particularly perhaps focusing on the capacity building needs of African policymakers and African players when it comes to e-commerce. And I think this also connects well to a question that was asked in the chat by Aizu. He asked, or she, asked, what is the role of world leaders in this discussion? How can they provide inclusion in e-commerce discussions? So I think that provides a good starting point to your reflections. Over to you, Africa.
Yes, thank you so much to the distinguished panel of speakers. So that was exciting. I think because of the connection challenge, maybe I should do audio. Is that fine?
Maybe turn off your video.
Okay, thank you so much. So I wish to do audio because of, yeah, thank you so much. Yeah. So regarding currently we are at e-commerce discussions were scheduled from under phase to be conducted under phase 3 of the negotiations. But when COVID-19 came in, there was a big push by by a group called Afro Champions. This is a group of big the expediting of the AFCFTA discussions. It pushed that we should have e-commerce put on the agenda, on the early agenda of the AFCFTA as a means of, and they call it anti-COVID trade. So e-commerce is looked as a means of facilitating the trade during the pandemic. So there have been discussions around consultations on the text of bringing e-commerce negotiations on the on the first phase of, on the second phase of the African Continental Free Trade Area, because currently, again, we are yet goods and the services. So e-commerce free trade area, which brings me to my 4 key speaking points this evening, Ms. Moderator. One is the question of the place of e-commerce in Africa. How do we contextualize e-commerce rules vis-a-vis e-commerce rules that are going to connect Africa to the global economy? There is a thin line between these 2 aspects, because largely we have African economies which are almost in trading in similar similar range of products. But the bigger we connect to global discussions, you find that the rules are looking into more liberalized approaches to e-commerce, even in further areas like data, where again Africa is still. There is a need to draw that thin line and contextualize e-commerce enabling rules at Africa level and e-commerce enabling rules at the global level, which takes me to the first submission of today. One, it is important African negotiators and African governments are supported in understanding the contestations to e-commerce, especially the contestations on the raw material of Industry 4.0, and that is big data. The importance of big data in creating a transformative agenda is very important. But currently, when you look at the discussions, even at the current exploratory level of e-commerce at the African Union level, you realize that less is being talked about when it comes to data governance, when it comes to data regulation. And that creates already a challenge on how you are going to trade and how you're going to leverage on data as Africa to be able to participate inclusively and competitively in e-commerce. And again, another aspect is the issue of coherence. African countries are now trapped between following the WTO process vis-a-vis first finalizing the AFCFTA process of e-commerce. Because you find that, like Yasmin put it, you find 6 countries, African countries, are already engaged in the JSI. There's already also indications that other countries are coming, like Uganda, are coming up to support the process. But you find that again, at the African Union level, we are yet to even conceptualize what the kind of e-commerce we shall need to advance the interest of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Now, that creates incoherence, and you might end up having a challenge of preference erosion, but also having a challenge of where you find that the policy space that would have been required in advancing e-commerce agenda in the African Continental Free Trade Area is eroded because of the far liberal rules that are being searched, that are being pushed for by the developed countries. My second submission, Madam Chair, is the question of how do we support African persons with the business community in the development of competitive digital products? Because again, the narrative that African negotiators is a do or die affair. We need to join e-commerce, we need to embrace e-commerce. But the question, the fact that Africa is still primarily a primary commodity dependent economy, it is important that we design avenues and rules that are going to be a competitive agent. And again, this brings the question of data flows. Is Africa going to be supplier of raw information? Because even Africa does not even have the capacity of synthesizing the information to produce big data. So that is important. Also, the issue of technology transfer and technology transfer in supporting, in developing regional digital value chains to be able to have a competitive Africa. The third and second last submission is the question of digital trade taxation. Africa still has a challenge regarding, we are still grappling with the question of data havens, because whereas we have developed capacity as Africa to track by the same big two data havens, and they are using these data havens to be able to dodge taxation. So it is important again also that in the discussions in the capacity in the capacity requirements for African of data havens and digital taxation capacities. The last aspect, which to me I think is the lifeline of e-commerce agenda and discussions, is the question of how do we tackle the digital divide that we are currently confronted with. At the dawn of the integrated continent, 75% of Africa is offline, and also in terms of high-speed internet, fixed broadband connection penetration, it is just at 4%. So you find that we are now already facing a challenge of digital would be supportive of addressing this very important question is critical. And so the capacity, like Kwanza was indicating, we are negotiating, we are showing the interest in e-commerce as Africa, but we know that are going to work in our favor. And what are these rules where we need to go through and have that process space which Yasmin was talking about? So the question of tackling the digital divide through rules that are going to create technology transfer, that are going to create local presence, that are going to create local content is very important. I beg to submit here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Africa. I think that you remind us that what we want to achieve with e-commerce negotiations, it's not just the liberalization of trade, but we have a responsibility to couple this goal also with the achievement of development. And this has been always important, but it's even more important after the pandemic, because we know that e-commerce will play a key role in economic recovery. And at the same time, we have a much better understanding very clearly on our faces about the gaps that we still face between different countries, between different regions when it comes to access to the infrastructure, not only the physical infrastructure, the internet and cables, but also the policy infrastructure and the capacities that are needed to promote really an inclusive e-commerce environment. So you raised some very interesting points, which I hope we can go back to during questions and answers, just reminding our audience that please feel free to forward your questions in the chat. We will be taking them in some minutes. But before that, we're going to turn to our last speaker in this session, Mr. Jacob Nienen. And I think that there's a good transition between what Africa just said and the points perhaps that you could discuss with us. Because when governments seek to develop e-commerce policy on a multilateral, regional and national level, they try to achieve some goals. They have some goals in mind. What should be the desired outcome of e-commerce policy and governance on developing countries from the perspective of non-governmental actors, from the perspective of businesses, for instance? Over to you, Jacob.
Thank you, Marilia. So a lot of my comments are going to be from my experience in the field. So as Marilia mentioned, my background is in a major global e-commerce platform provider. In the last few years, I've been more working on cross-border trade, mainly targeting small and medium enterprises. So I've had the opportunity to work with most of the major stakeholders who operate in this space. So the comments I make are observations that are from the field. Let me start with a few, let me just start with describing 4 of the foundational pillars that I feel are important for e-commerce. I'll start with the first pillar, which is the people pillar. When I talk about people, I'm talking about the different stakeholders, whether it's buyers, sellers, intermediaries, traders, SMEs, small and medium enterprises, people in the government, regulators. So the whole breadth of stakeholders who are involved. So you can see there is there is quite a bit of interest for each of these stakeholders, and these interests are sometimes aligned, but sometimes against each other. So this is an important thing to keep in mind. The people also have needs from a standpoint of skills, because the technology in e-commerce is advancing as over year, and even for technically savvy people, it's very difficult to keep abreast with the technology. And then there are issues around knowledge management, around content. So these are all topics that are very important, and this is even more important from a local context. Let me move to the second pillar. The second pillar is what I call the platform. The platform, what we define as a platform, is the infrastructure itself. So it can be the internet infrastructure, it can be the mobile infrastructure, because e-commerce can also happen entirely on mobile, right? I mean, you don't need a internet to work. So you can enable the e-commerce activities by mobile as well. The architecture, the physical assets for actually enabling e-commerce, the logistics, etc. So this is the second piece of the pillar. The third pillar I would like to define is the policy framework, the policy itself. So trade agreements, UNMLETR. So as I mentioned, in cross-border trade, one of the important pieces that are coming out is the United Nations Model Law for Electronic Transfer of Records, which actually is a digitization of title documents, which gives ownership for the cargo or the items that are shipped cross-border. Single window clearances, legal frameworks in the country to facilitate this. So whether it's payments, whether it's around data or governance. And the other point to note is also that the policy part is getting more and more technology heavy. So the discussions have, or discussant need to have some fair understanding on how data operates, data standards, data privacy. Very shortly in the future, we might have an algorithm bot who might be a trader, who might buy or sell, or who might make payments. So these are things that are going to come. So reading technology, understanding it, and being able to negotiate is very important. Lastly, I would like to add something around planet. And planet is probably not, is something probably that would be coming on more and more. It's about green and sustainable supply chains. So considering these three or these four pillars, the governments and the negotiators have an unenviable task. As I mentioned, I mean, these are very difficult managing these conflicting interests is not an easy task. So if you look at a government or a local government, they would have a few interests in facilitating a regulatory environment which enables growth for e-commerce, right? I mean, in their country, they want to facilitate that. That's a very important part. Empowering the domestic entrepreneurs and making in the country is also a very important piece. So how can local manufacturing or local services be enabled for e-commerce? Safeguarding interests of consumers is another important aspect. So ensuring that the consumers have their rights, be able to standardize on products, and be able to provide quality certifications and so on and so forth. Leveraging access of data, mainstreaming the segments of the economy and providing the access for the digital ecosystem for, especially for the small and medium enterprises who probably would not have all the skills. So from a country standpoint, these are some of the things that probably are very important. And from a negotiation standpoint, this would probably be needed to be taken into consideration. I did see a question around how technology could help in such negotiations. And I always think that just as technology is technology can be a digital divider, technology can also be used for digital inclusion, because that is the good thing about technology, because one can actually use the technology to actually provide this inclusion and provide the maintenance of a level playing field. Of course, this needs that the many facets of those pillars that we talked about. But I think these things can be done as technology, as we can use these technologies for the benefit as well for the country. So let me just close with a few final words. So in order to enhance the capabilities and realize the potential of electronic commerce, it's imperative that countries develop a robust administrative, regulatory, and legal mechanism. So from their standpoint, this has to be in place, and then build the national e-commerce policy, which can address many issues around consumer protection or data privacy or maintenance of a level playing field and so on and so forth. So I think I will stop here, and I'm glad to take any questions as it comes. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you very much, Jacob. I think that we really end this segment on a high note, putting the discussions that we are having here, which have been focused on e-commerce, into a broader perspective. I like the way that you conducted us from the analysis, from the individual to the institutions, to the environment and the sustainability of the environment itself. I think it's really important to have this holistic perspective. I do not see written questions on the chat, but if you would like to ask questions, you could try to raise your hand as well. I would be happy to give the mic to someone who would like to intervene. I'm sure that we can do that. Are there any questions in this point? I don't see any hands. While our audience thinks about their questions, I just would like to go back to Yasmin. Yasmin, we talked about capacity building a lot, and I know that this is a topic that has been in the GSI under negotiations, capacity building, technical assistance. What has been tackled in the GSI? What is the status of these discussions, and what are the key issues there?
Thank you, Maria. Well, there are two things when it comes to the, let's say, the development aspects in the negotiations. We have this technical assistance and capacity building. We have some general clauses, so not particularly related to a certain theme, and it's included in the consolidated text as a sub-item or a cross-cutting issue. And for this one, we had several proposals, one by China at the very beginning, but also Indonesia and Cote d'Ivoire, who recently submitted a proposal with suggesting some new texts or amendments. And it's sort of, it is an evolving, let's say, topic, because I think the more the negotiations went from a theme to another and started going from less complex to more complex issues, the more developing countries were able to see that this will be an important element, a very important element in the negotiations. So we started to see more interest in the topic, and it started to also become a subject of many sessions and discussions, whether in the WTO or outside the WTO. In terms of what is in there, the proposals are varying in the level of commitment when it comes to providing capacity building and technical assistance for developing countries. So some proposals are more of self-endeavors proposals and volunteering to provide sharing experience, provide capacity building for e-commerce, while, for example, the Côte d'Ivoire proposal is suggesting more commitments from developed countries and developing countries with the capacity to provide this assistance to less developed countries and small developing countries to provide it. So it's more hard clauses for these commitments. Also, there is the other dimension of development considerations in the negotiations, which, due to the non-clarity yet about what will be the outcome of this process, multilateral, plurilateral, MFN, what will be the shape, the legal shape of this outcome, is not yet being discussed fully, like the SLD, for example. But there has been the latest proposal just like a few days before the MC12 was supposed to take place, a proposal to suggest flexibilities in the implementation. So sort of a new topic or a new theme under the texts, to have a flexibility of implementation that is that gives the developing countries the right to choose which topics they would like to have longer durations for their implementation, and with limited possibility of renewal of this flexibility. So it's sort of similar to somehow similar to the approach of the TFA, but not with the three categories. It will be more subject to the choice of the developing country.
Thank you, Yasmin. That's enlightening and good to know when you always know the latest developments. So it's always interesting to hear from you. I don't see any questions in the chat, and I know that we are approaching the end of our session. So I would like to give the speakers the chance to make some final remarks. We just heard from Yasmin, so perhaps I should move to Juan, Africa, and Jacob for some very short 1 minute remarks. Juan.
Well, thank you, Marilia. Just to follow up on what Jasmine said, I think the TFA model, the trade facilitation model, is given inspiration to the trade negotiators in these GSI negotiations. So basically, I think what it does is it categorizes the obligations into different groups, and that countries may have the flexibility to choose which ones they will implement as the situation matures in their country. Maybe the latest proposal is going beyond the categories, but given even more flexibility in terms of the choice of the provisions. And also linked to that is certainly the capacity building provisions. I think normally developing countries, and at least developed countries, would request strong, concrete commitments on capacity building. But usually what comes out of the negotiation is probably a best endeavor clause. So how to concretize those commitments, I think, is one of the issues that we can all think about. And also the third point is that in the process of building these commitments and also capacity building provisions, like same in the case of TFA, there was a process of identification of gaps for individual countries and members. So that process, I think, is also important because the members need to assess the possible outcomes against their own regulatory frameworks to see how much efforts are needed and how long it takes to implement the outcomes. So just 3 additional thoughts on these.
Very important points, and very good to remind ourselves of how the TFA can offer some lessons and shed light on the present situation in the GSI. Africa, please.
Yes, thank you so much. And just one more thing. In my thinking, a transformative e-commerce agenda is very critical for Africa. And by transformative, it should look into the long-standing systemic challenges by Africa in not only global trade, but also in continental trade, and especially the aspect of governance of data and the issue of technology transfer. Because again, synchronizing between what is happening at the World Trade Organization, JSI process, and what is happening in the desirable e-commerce agenda at the African Continental Free Trade Area is critical, but that only requires if we slow down the e-commerce discussions juggernaut at the WTO, because like you see, Kwan is saying, we are asking for capacity building and then negotiating. You cannot do these 2 things concurrently. Building the competencies of African negotiators and African countries in comprehending and understanding the e-commerce agenda helps in boosting confidence, but also supporting them in developing their
I think we lost you.
Alternative texts that puts into consideration and context their desirable outcomes out of e-commerce. Those imperative.
Thank you, Africa. We lost the very end, but I think that we got the main points that you wanted to put across. Jacob, your final words.
Yeah, thanks, Marilia. Yeah, I think the important thing is that a lot of, I think we all agree that more and more of trade and e-commerce is going to go digital. I mean, it's going to go electronic. So this is something that needs to be addressed, and at least to a large extent, a level playing field should be set up. Otherwise, it's the consequences would be really devastating, because for specific countries who might not be able to trade. To start with, possibly the thing that could help is capacity building in terms of the skills, the ability to engage, and engaging in projects would be probably a good start point. And I think the best time to do it was yesterday, but the second best time is today. So I think we should start immediately. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all the speakers and everyone that stayed with us. I will not try to summarize everything that has been said, but I think that what stays with me is the importance that we understand the moment of negotiations in the GSI, to be able to intervene at the right time when the issues are being tabled. And Yasmin made that clear when she mentioned about green issues, the red and yellow ones, the need to make the connection between what happens in Geneva and what is going on in the capitals is key, and capacity building is also a way to do that. We need to think about capacity building not only from a policy perspective, but also create the conditions for different countries to generate wealth from the digital economy, including data. And we need to have an holistic perspective when we think about these issues, considering capacity building that comes from the individual, the institutions, and the system and society as a whole. And I think that was a very important point raised by Jacob. With that, I would like to thank again the speakers, thank IIST for providing the opportunity for us to hold the discussions, and a thank for the participants that stayed with us until the end. Thank you. Have a good continuation of discussions. Good afternoon. Goodbye.